how did you first come to meet Alex Houston?
I came to meet Alex Houston in the mid-'80s when he was introduced to me because he had an idea to put a company together with the People's Republic of China, a joint venture company. And he knew I had State Department connections, and he knew that I had business background, very successful, so he elected to make me the president of the company, and we put this business together, a legitimate business manufacturing capacitor banks for the mining industry. Well, it was the Chinese that told me that Alex Houston was involved in all these nefarious acts, and they did show me hard proof.
Okay, but you were approached by a Chinese intelligence officer who gave you this information. What did he tell you?
The Chinese intelligence officer told me that Alex Houston was involved in child and adult pornography. He was involved in drug running, and he was involved in money laundering for the Central Intelligence Agency, and it went all the way to the White House. Now, he alluded to that woman and her child that were in Mr. Houston's charge, I think his exact words were. He didn't say they were married. He didn't say that they were related or even anything else. He said that they were Alex Houston's charges. I believe were the exact words.
Okay, so you then returned to the U.S. and began to investigate the information you were given about Alex Houston. How did that process begin?
After about a week, I think, of thinking about it, I went ahead and began to reconnect with some people who were still active within military intelligence. Two people I met in a restaurant in Clarksville, Tennessee, that were attached to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. They were CIA. I met with them. And these men told me, basically, that what I had heard in China was most likely true. And that they didn't personally know Alex Houston, but they knew exactly what I was talking about. And that I had, in fact, bumped into something that I couldn't do anything about. I asked them if they could please steer me in the direction of someone who could help Cathy and her daughter break free mentally of their CIA mind control existence. They told me that they would look into it, but it was too risky, in essence, that I need to look somewhere else. Why didn't I contact one of my other friends? And they had told me all they could tell me. It was at that point that I began to believe that there were plenty of good psychiatrists and psychologists, particularly the ones that have engaged in research in mind control that I knew of, like UCLA's Jolene West and others that I thought could be a possible help in helping me get Cathy and her daughter into therapy, because my intentions were to go back to China. I had no intentions of staying in the United States. During this week period of time, I discovered that my bank accounts had been pilfered.
So did you think that the action on your accounts was due to what you knew about Cathy and her daughter?
At the time that my bank accounts were just suddenly disappearing, I really, the only way I could do anything was to surmise that Cathy O'Brien might be the reason that my accounts disappeared, because I knew about her. And I had inquired as to the validity of the charges that the Chinese had given me about Alex Houston and what he was doing.
Okay, so now you're starting to believe that Cathy and her daughter are being kept under mind control by Alex Houston. Why didn't you just rescue them?
Quite honestly, I didn't really know how to get her out of there. I didn't know how to trigger her out of her existence because I didn't know what her programs were. However, I did have one person who had worked in a capacity to where this individual did know codes, keys, and triggers. And he told me, he said the most common trigger used by the CIA at that level on individuals, whether they be military or whether they be civilian, is the voice of God. And I said, what? And he said, use the voice of God. I said, what does God sound like? And he said, just call her on the telephone and tell her you're God. And I said, yeah, right. What else do I tell her? He said, I'll get back with you. He called me back in a number of hours and explained to me that I was to give her a Bible scripture. And that was Psalms 37:37. Well, I had some knowledge of the Bible. I went and looked at that Bible scripture, and it said, Mark, the perfect man. I thought, this is ludicrous. So I called her up as the voice of God, and I told her to read Psalms 37:37 and meet this man at the Burger King restaurant in Goodlettsville, Tennessee at such a time, on such a day, which was actually the following day. I went to the Burger King really not expecting to see this woman. She walks in with a plastic smile, great big eyes, and she comes in and she looks at me as though I'm from off the planet, and she said, God sent me to you.
Were you able to discern from your past work that she was in a trance?
There was no question. There was no question as to Cathy's mental condition at that time, because that was the first time that I'd had the opportunity to sit down with her one-on-one without anybody else being around and literally ask her some questions in a literal mode and test her level of suggestibility and determine that she was indeed under someone else's mind-controlled influence. Now, who that person was, at that point in time, I did not know, other than Alex Houston.
So at this point, you orchestrated an intermediary rescue of Cathy and her daughter. What was Houston's reaction?
I called him up, or he called me, I'm sorry. Alex Houston called me and said, have you talked to Cathy? I said, no. I said, I really don't talk with Cathy. He said, well, she's gone. I said, well, I wouldn't have any way of knowing. And he said, well, I can't understand it. I mean, she's gone. She's taken my VCR. And at that point in time, I was just about to fall on the floor because I just lost $2 million, and he's complaining about a VCR. And I don't know why. It's still funny to this day. He was complaining about all these little things that she took out of the house, which absolutely was nothing. She took nothing, amounted to anything, except some medical equipment for her daughter and his VCR.
So what made you guys finally have to leave Tennessee?
After 2 or 3 months of taking care of my business and trying to get my money back and et cetera, I ran into another problem. This same deputy called me up and told me the sheriff of my county wanted to see me. I went to see the sheriff, and the sheriff told me, he said, Mark, I don't know what you're into. It has something to do with that woman that's in your house. I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, you know that we work very closely with the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He said, someone from the FBI in the Nashville, Tennessee office came into this office and told me that you were scheduled for a hit by the CIA. I said, well, now that's their job to stop this. I said, CIA's not supposed to be operating on domestic soil, according to the Constitution. He said, Mark, I don't want to hear any of this. I want you to get out of my county. I want you to leave now. I don't care where you go. Just get out of my county. I said, well, I have a house here. I have property here. He said, sell it and leave. Give it away. Just leave it. Abandon it. Do whatever you need to do. But you're going to leave. I said, what, are you threatening me? He said, no, I'm begging you. Please leave. After
leaving Tennessee, you went to find some of your old spook friends in Nevada, but they weren't much help. Talk about what you did after that.
After being sorely disappointed in Nevada and told that I had just got on the back of the tiger, that was what they told me. They said, now you're on the back of the tiger. You're going to ride that tiger until it falls. Because if you get off, it'll eat you alive, and there's nothing anybody can do. You have far, far outstepped your even common logic. I said, well, what should I do? They said, if I were you, I would go some remote place on this planet and act like you weren't ever coming back. Well, at that point in time, I came back and told Cathy, I said, I'm going to take you to the top of the world. Well, that meant that she would have an overview of all the bad people, but she wouldn't be exposed to them. She said, the top of the world? Where is that? I said, it's far, far, far from here. It's in the cold, icy, frigid north. She said, well, I came from Michigan and it's cold, or something to that effect. And I said, well, you'll love this place. It's not as cold as Michigan, even though it's far, far north of it. She said, where? And I studied her face, and I realized that There was a very good chance that neither one was going to make it there alive. So I said, I'm taking you to Alaska. I used to work there. I know everybody, and there's only 2 ways in that place. Actually, there's 3. Air, sea, and 1 road. Everybody gets their picture taken. I thought, at least, I've got some friends in the intelligence community that will dispose of whoever kills me after they do it. I was absolutely convinced that my chances of survival were 1 in a million at that point. I had nothing to lose. Everything in my life had been destroyed, it seemed like overnight, even though it took months.
So what was the process of you deprogramming her? The
process of deprogramming is really the person, you don't deprogram anybody, the person deprograms himself. You establish that they're safe, not only in reality but in their mind. You establish a trust bond between the 2 of you. In this case, it was absolute trust, because she was seeing that I had lost everything, that I had been a very successful businessman before, and all of a sudden nothing. I'm driving around in a Pacer. There's any number of things that were, obvious to even somebody in her condition. So it took about 9 months of her writing out her memories, and then me taking those memories, holding them 3 weeks, letting her look at them, and if she remembered them, fine. If she didn't remember them, actually I tossed them in the trash, because in retrospect I did the right thing.
Okay, before we get any further, I just want you to explain the whole concept of harmonics and how Cathy was programmed using tones and then what you call triggers.
Everything on this planet vibrates at a different rate. Absolutely everything, even on a cellular level. What we're looking at here is the effect of changing that vibration at the brainstem. And once that's done, once that's understood, which is clearly understood now, we can begin to understand how to control the mind of an individual externally by simply changing the vibration at the brainstem. Unfortunately, this is a very dangerous science, because the brainstem can be damaged by combinations of harmonics. Cathy related to it as harmonic hell, and it was the sound, she claimed, of 2 rusty ships rubbing and scrubbing in the night. Well, I know this is when she described it, it was one of those things she could not possibly have known, because I was sworn to secrecy not to ever divulge that information, even though it was just describing a tone. Well, every word that you and I are saying is a combination of tones. And if we learn how to control the modulation of those tones, we can actually affect someone's subconscious. And this has been known since the 40s.
In the case of Cathy O'Brien, how would they create triggers in her memory that would then help them in some form of either sexual or espionage endeavor?
Well, quite easily, because you must remember that someone like Cathy O'Brien, or anyone who's exposed to repetitious trauma prior to age 5, has an extraordinary high suggestibility level. They're very literal. Like she was telling me that she went into a place in the back of the White House that it said, "Serve us entranced." And I'm going, that's absurd in my own mind, but I'm not saying anything to her. And then all of a sudden, while sitting and going over my notes far away from her, I write it out and it says service entrance. That is the literal mind. She was told this is serve us entranced. So the next step, of course, was to see if she could remember or write out the name or person or persons who were responsible for delivering that message. Because what they actually did act as a trigger. Because she had been pre-programmed with the word entranced and serve us. Okay? In serve us of her country is the way she was taught.
What was your reaction to her when she started talking about major, like the president? Well,
my reaction to Cathy's first information was, in spite of all that had happened, was disbelief. First of all, I had never been exposed to the phenomena of pedophilia or adults having sex with children. It didn't equate in my mind. I knew that it was obvious, and I had studied all the Hemmer stuff, and I knew that it existed, but I didn't relate to it. And to be naming top people in Washington all the way to the presidency, including George Bush, I had a great deal of difficulty because I met George Bush, and I knew a lot of these people. I thank God didn't know Byrd. However, I did know a lot of the people she was mentioning, not personally, but I had met them at parties or had been inaugurations or whatever. And more or less in my mind, I had an acquaintance with them.
So you were shocked.
I was shocked. I was in a state of shock that I could not relate to what she was saying, nor could I believe that it was all true. I thought it might be some screen memory or something that was planted memory to destroy her credibility. And at that point in time, the only proofs that I had was on Alex Houston and some operations with NASA and some events that were very specific to her victimization that occurred in the state of Alabama and Tennessee and in Michigan. That's all I had.
What did you do with the stuff that you thought was provable?
I took those memories that she had recovered and the details, the maps, everything that she handed me, and I turned it over to people that I knew within federal law enforcement, not FBI, federal law enforcement, and I'll tell you one of them was Customs. I turned it over to them, and they in turn provided me with enough substantiation and proofs that I could prosecute. But nowhere at any time did anybody tell me that what she was recovering as far as memory goes on George Bush or any of these other things could have any plausible reality. So I really didn't focus on those at that time. It wasn't until after we got back that I had an opportunity to reconnect with some of my former associates and people within the intelligence community and validate the fact that some of these people are engaged in those atrocious things.
Now, where was Kelly at this point?
While we were in Alaska and Kelly was safe, she started beginning to have memory flashes, and she went into respiratory failure. So we took her to Humana Hospital, and the diagnosis there, they could not find any biological reason for her respiratory failure. So they brought in a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist was state appointed. The psychiatrist had seen many mind control cases because of the Air Force Base up there and because of, you know, espionage being launched out of Anchorage in that area for years. When this doctor, Patrick was her name, a psychiatrist for the state, evaluated Kelly, she wrote in Kelly's medical documents, as published in the book, that Kelly was a victim of mind control. That was the first time anyone had validated that on paper that was not connected to us or anybody that I knew. And she reported in that, further reported in that medical statement that Cathy had been a victim and that she was in the process of recovering from a dissociative identity disorder. Now, Cathy had never been officially diagnosed, because if she'd been officially diagnosed at that point in time, she could never have appeared in court. So I never allowed her to have official diagnosis. It was a safety factor, a legal thing.
So now what happened with Kelly?
Well, Kelly went into the hospital and she never came out.
Just to go back for a minute, Kelly was suffering from respiratory failure due to her programming. Can you just explain how it was used to keep her away from Cathy?
The programming, again, was, again, the same as Cathy's, except Cathy's was digestive, Kelly's was respiratory. And respiratory is the most common programming used to kill spies who are captured.
So how did the programming play out with Kelly? How did they use it against Kelly?
Kelly went into what is known as an asthmatic attack. She doesn't actually have asthma, but she would go into a complete asthmatic attack, turn blue, stop breathing, and she'd have to be rushed into the hospital after just a few minutes in her mother's company. So it became so horrible for Cathy, because she loves her daughter and she wanted to help her and she wanted to give her comfort, because her daughter had already been through hell all her life, and then now she's being raised in an institution. Not even one institution. She's been bounced around all over the place.
Explain what happened when you guys returned to Tennessee and tried to regain custody of Kelly.
So the state of Tennessee, when they took custody of Kelly, when she'd been transferred from the Kentucky facility, we began to fight our case. And when we brought our evidences into the court, Cathy was charged $2 million in child support. this was quite a surprise, but not a surprise. We knew that they were going to use this to keep Cathy away from her daughter, because they knew Cathy would have to flee. She couldn't have to pay $2 million or go to jail. Well, the district attorney happened to be someone of extraordinary ethics for that particular court. And he stood up and he said, "Your Honor, you're violating every law that I know of." And the judge said in open court, "Laws do not apply in this case for reasons of national security." He said it in front of court watchers. He said it in front of about 8 or 9 lawyers, in addition to people that, who knows who they were. They were sitting in the courtroom.
And what's the significance of...
The significance of it is simply this. That judge, in essence, saved our lives, because he absolutely said publicly that the United States government was responsible for covering up this case. And even though he didn't have to state why, and we weren't allowed to present our evidences, we knew at that point in time that we could not prosecute our case in any state, federal, criminal or civil court. The 1947 National Security Act I had worked under for years. I knew exactly every tenant in it. So I told Cathy, when she was crying and crying when she left the courtroom, she said, "There is no justice." I said, "You just got the greatest form of justice that I know of." And I'm still, my ears are ringing with what that judge said.
How do you define justice in this case? Has it been granted, and what are you guys going for?
The only justice that Cathy and I have been able to see is our ability to exercise our First Amendment rights. Since that judge invoked the National Security Act in open court, it allowed us to self-publish our book, which was in essence not even a book, and I still don't call it a book. It's a documentary of what happened to Cathy that we can prove, and what happened to Kelly that we can prove, and what happened to me after I rescued him.
Have people outside of your circle of friends been given copies of the book?
Every person in Washington, we sent over 1,100 certified mailings well before the book was ever published of the contents in Transformation of America. That was done over a 2-year period of time, a 3-year period of time, from 91 to 94. In 95, we thought we were going to be able to address the House Intelligence Select Committee on Intelligence Oversight. It was in April of 95 when we were turned down the last time. Our lawyer, who's a federal lawyer, advised us on good advice to take that portion of the documentation that we had, which was quite extensive, and we actually sent to Washington to well over 1,000 people in both houses of Congress, within the Pentagon. I mean, every single one. The reason that they're mentioned in that book is because I didn't want anybody coming back and say, "Well, if you just contacted me, we could have fixed this." But no, you just broke this law, this law, this law. I said, "Cathy, we're not going to leave any stone unturned." So we sent them out.
Let's start off like just, when you put your book out, how did you expect people to respond to it?
When we put the book out, we put it out for the Congressional Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and it wasn't meant for the mainstream public. We had hoped that by taking the information to Congress that we'd be able to bring about some changes that way, overcome the 1947 National Security Act. When that didn't happen, it did start going hand to hand to different people throughout the country, and it was never publicized properly. So I never really anticipated any kind of a response, because I knew it was pretty much out of the realm of most people's point of reference. A lot of people didn't have a point of reference for it, especially back in 1995. A lot more have a point of reference for it today. But so I never really anticipated a response, and I certainly didn't expect a warm one.
Can you just talk about the criminal environment you were living in, your father was selling to, and how he supplemented the family income?
My father supplemented the family income with the proceeds from child pornography, which was being sold through the local Michigan Mafia child pornography ring. it was well established and was being sanctioned by a criminal faction of the government that was targeting children like myself for mind control. The dissociative disorder that I suffered from was something that any child that was being used in pornography would have, and is a strong basis for mind control.
Do you think your parents, I mean, obviously later you were into a high-tech realm of programming. Do you think your parents had any idea that they were in fact programming you for something?
They did when my father sold me into MKUltra. He was aware on all levels of what it was about and exactly what it was for, what it would entail, and he would say, even way back then, he'd say things like, spies are made, not born, and so he knew that I would have to be made, and he'd been taught how to raise me in the project according to conditioning me with childhood themes and continuing abuse and taking me to certain places according to the instructions of the political people that were directing his actions.
How did your life change once you became part of the program?
Once I became part of the program, my free thought began eroding more and more at a pretty rapid rate through extreme traumas like occult trauma.
Well, talk about, in your own way, how you interpret the clinical effect of trauma on the brain.
When trauma occurs, the brain actually compartmentalizes the memory of the event so the rest of the mind can function normally. And since the dissociative disorder is defined as the mind's sane defense to trauma too horrible to comprehend, the occultism was certainly too horrible to comprehend, as was the incest and the sexual abuse. So it was actually creating more compartments in my mind, and the more compartments that were created, the less of me there was. And then pretty soon I was just operating with no conscious awareness of what had happened before, what was going to happen, and I began living only in the moment and operating on a subconscious level, which left me highly suggestible to where I would do exactly what I was told to do rather than think to go do something on my own.
Your dad had a sixth-grade education. He wasn't incredibly intelligent. Was he able to control all these compartments?
My father didn't have to control all the compartments in my brain. He would take me to Mackinac Island, Michigan, which is where the Michigan Governor's Mansion is located, and that was one area where I was subjected to a more high-tech level of mind manipulation, and where I eventually met who'd be my owner in MKUltra Mind Control, U.S. Senator Robert C. Byrd. Once Senator Byrd became my owner, he directed my programming to be on a much more sophisticated level to U.S. military bases and NASA installations throughout the United States.
How has your father benefited from this program?
When my father was first approached by Gerald Ford, he was earning his living as a worm digger, and he had a sixth-grade education, and he wasn't a real intelligent or ambitious type person, and he didn't have the kind of drive and self-esteem that would take him any further, except for the fact that by the time I was 13 and Senator Byrd became my owner in MKUltra, Senator Byrd was head of U.S. Senate Appropriations for many, many years, and he decided where money would be appropriated, and when my father sold me into the project, he received lucrative military contracts that worked in a parts manufacturing camshafts for military vehicles, and ultimately made him extremely wealthy just because of selling his children into the project.
You talk about Robert C. Byrd becoming your owner. When was the first time that you were told of this?
Well, I knew that Senator Byrd was my owner, like the first time that I was with him, I knew that he would be my owner. I didn't think of him so much as an owner, as someone who was directing my activities from that point. He would decide where I would be taken and when, who would be my handlers. Of course, my father was my handler until I became of legal age. At 18, my handler was Wayne Cox, as appointed by Senator Byrd. Senator Byrd wanted Wayne Cox to be my handler because he was already involved in government operations, especially where mercenaries were concerned, where the CIA covert operations were concerned, and he was also a part of an extreme trauma base. Senator Byrd wanted more compartments created in my mind through the severity of the trauma that I did experience with Wayne Cox.
Let's talk about going to Washington, and where would you meet Byrd, and how would he talk to you? Is it different than a normal person?
Well, Senator Byrd never talked to me like a friend or someone that he talked to me more like an object or a possession or a chess piece to be moved around in a game wherever he decided. An example of how I would get to Washington, D.C. would be that my next handler and final handler in MK Ultra Mind Control was Alex Houston. Alex Houston is a ventriloquist stage hypnotist in the country music industry. The country music industry provided a cover or a means of traveling to the various military and NASA installations and in and out of the Caribbean, across the United States, and into Washington, D.C.
How was Houston's identity in the country music scene used to facilitate your role in the program?
When Alex Houston would be booked into certain areas, they were always done according to the different operations that I would be used in and right close to the vicinity, so that I would be sure to be available for whatever operations or perversions I was going to be used in. For example, going into Washington, D.C., then I would be taken to the Smithsonian Institute and would stand in a strategic place where I was supposed to meet whoever my contact was that would escort me into the White House. So whether it be Park Service or Secret Service, somebody would come over and get me to take me into the White House. And I would stand at the Wizard of Oz, ruby slippers and the witch's hat. Or they had this face-changing booth in there that was also a part of programming. Whatever was already attached to my programming, it would already, when I saw it, it would trigger me into a trance. So I'd be standing there in trance when my contacts would come to take me into the White House. We'd go across the mall or the lawn, the park, whatever term you want to call it, over to the White House, go in the service entrance of the White House that was kind of around the side, and said service entrance on it meant serve us in trance to me.
You write extensively about your visits to Reagan after being prosecuted by Byrd. Can you explain how that got started?
Senator Byrd wanted to have a closer association with Ronald Reagan, so I was brought into a White House party, and I met Ronald Reagan while he was president, and I was to be used in different operations. So Ronald Reagan already knew that I would be used that way, but also knew that I had been used in pornography, which he was very much interested in, and was very interested in the use of pornography on a covert level where it would actually compromise certain government leaders.
There's different tools they would use, obviously, when they're in mind control. What's one of the, I mean, there's obviously codes, keys, and triggers, but is there other forms of tools that are used commonly in mind control?
Stun guns were the most commonly used form of trauma for mind control, and it was a tool that could be used outside of the major programming centers to drop me, to transport me into different places, to compartmentalize memory. It was used by various escorts. My handler, predominantly Alex Houston, used a stun gun all the time. It was used by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino of the Psychological Warfare Division, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he was the founder of the Occult Temple of Set.
We'll go into that separately. What kind of effect is long-term effects do these stun guns leave on people?
The stun guns result in a weakening of the skin where they hit, and it creates either moles eventually will rise up from it, or there will be little white holes that never really tan, and there's red spots that come from it.
If you were walking on the street or looking at the same porn magazines, would you be able to identify people who had prod marks?
Before harmonics were used so strongly, the prod marks were heavily used to the point where the stun gun prod marks would be raised up on a person, and strategic places would be indicative of the form of operation that they were to be used in. For example, the ones that were located on the left side of the face was usually indicative of some kind of message delivery or a photographic recording that could be going on by the program person. The ones on the throat were indicative of sex programming, oral sex programming. The different places where they were located were clear indicators to people in the know what kind of mode of operation I was working in.
What would you say was the most traumatic thing you endured during your exposure to the mind control program?
The most traumatic thing that I ever endured was not being able to protect my daughter. And it was always a trauma base for me. It was an extreme trauma base because it went against my maternal instincts. Everything that I had hoped for as a child, everything that I am inside to want to love her and protect her and take good care of her and give her a wonderful and safe environment, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't think to do that.
What was the nature of Kelly's exposure to the project?
Kelly was born into the project on a level where she was subjected to high-tech mind control programming on a harmonic level, literally from birth.
In the book, you described Kelly as having an abnormally high level of intelligence for her age. How did her programming differ from yours?
I developed compartmentalization from trauma. She developed it from the harmonics, which actually vibrates the neuron pathways instead of having the trauma create the compartmentalization. So since she had that so early on, she was also receptive to anything that was put in there and would photographically remember it when triggered open, and that would include this incredible vocabulary that she had at such an early age.
So where would this high-tech programming take place?
Fort Campbell, Kentucky was another place where she was exposed to the most sophisticated levels of mind control programming. They had all the equipment and capability already established there for military special forces. It's where the 101st Airborne is trained, and it's where she was being programmed just right after birth because we'd already been transferred to Nashville by that time.
When Mark was freeing you, freeing your mind, how did it start to occur? Like, did memories just start flying out of your head? What was it like?
When Mark first rescued Kelly and I, he took us to the safety and serenity of Alaska, which it was so peaceful and so beautiful. We weren't being abused. We were safe for the first time. We knew love. And as a result, it's a natural phenomena that that a person would begin to remember little bits and pieces. Besides, we were in extreme danger. We had a lot of problems. Mark's bank accounts had been cleared out. We'd received a lot of threats because of something that I couldn't remember. As a matter of fact, I became aware that I didn't know what had happened to over 10 years of my life at all. I had no recollection at all, totally amnesic. I even thought I was still 24 years old when I was actually 30 years old. So those things all lent to the very beginning of beginning to remember. And as I began to remember, Mark taught me a method that was very effective to recall what's incomprehensible. Since the disorder that I had was resulting from trauma too horrible to comprehend, it had to be made comprehensible in order to take those walls down in my mind and take the compartmentalization down. So in order for it to be comprehensible, the best way was to deal with it logically. Emotionally, there's no place for the kind of horror that my daughter and I experienced, but logically, I began to understand, and the logic was accessed by writing out my memories. When a person moves a pen, the logic portion of their brain is what actually controls the pen, so automatically the memory is shifted over to logic and comes out on paper, and it's a very, very safe and easy way of being able to remember what was actually photographically recorded.
How did Kelly respond to Mark?
She loved Mark very, very much. She still loves Mark very, very much. she felt safe with him. He wasn't abusing her. He was obviously loving. The animals loved him, and that had a profound effect on her as well. Kelly has a strong love for animals, and since we couldn't think, our senses were heightened, like a blind person's hearing is accentuated. Our senses were heightened to where we had senses like an animal and knew that he was good, and the animals loved him, and it was just, it had a profound effect on Kelly. She knew that goodness did exist in the world, that animals could be safe in places, that love was available, and that has given her a lot of hope for returning to a normal life once she receives her last bit of technological rehabilitation that she so desperately needs.